if you could die at any time for things like that, why stop? In terms of what I do now, so I would say during the day, I work a lot on managing money, managing pension fund money under a kind of sustainable investment framework. And then I have a lot of other interests. So I host a podcast myself with long-form conversation. I have a newsletter. I'm very interested in other sorts of things. So I run a set of microgrants for people, giving away money, small amounts of money to people who want to make a positive impact. Most recently, I've actually just won a grant from Tyler Cowen's Emergent Ventures to do an unconference on home education, which is one area that I'm really interested in.
What does unconference mean?
So, unconference. So this is a whole other thing.
Because you run unconferences at Chatham House, right?
Yeah, so I've run an unconference at Chatham House. So an unconference is, I guess by its name, it's a little bit of a reverse of a normal conference. I like a lot of things which are reverse. So in a normal conference, you go up, you go there, there's a set agenda. People talk at you and say, this is how you should think, or this is our idea, or whatever, and you sit around and you're lectured to. An unconference, the people who turn up, the people in the room, are the ones who set the agenda. So you just come along, you have a theme or a topic. So for instance, it could be how best should we improve non-mainstream education, or what does homeschool mean to you? And then this form of unconference, which is based on open space, you sit around first of all in a circle, and then you come up and you announce it. So you might say, I want to talk about how technology is going to influence homeschool. I think the future of non-mainstream education are microschools. I want to talk about my experience of flexi-schooling. I want to talk about the legal issues around homeschool. And all of those you then put on a timetable, so you can be technology-wise, so you could use it on like a WhatsApp or a Discord, or usually just old school, like little kind of post-it notes on a timetable. And then everyone who wants to say something can, and you can just go to whatever things has been interested. And there's very few rules in unconferences, but one of the major ones is really is kind of often called the law of mobility, or the law of 2 feet, which means that if you're not enjoying, or you don't think you're getting anything from the meeting you're in, then you should move. You have to use your own agency to go and move to another one. So if someone is having a domineering, really poor meeting, then it's incumbent upon the people listening to say, we're not getting anything out of this, and then you should move. So you end up moving to that. So
ideally, to a different room?
Yeah, different room, different group. You can host your own group. So in theory, you can't have a bad conference, because there's two things. One is, if the person's boring, you should move. If you're not getting anything out of it, it's not a match. Second is, if the topic you want to hear about is not there, you should call it yourself. So that's the idea. There's actually various forms of unconference. The one I tend to run uses these kind of open space principles, and there's a few more. But I'm really interested in anything which means that you have to use your agency, and also this form of conference, particularly when there is no consensus idea. So sustainability, or projects that you want to work on, or improvements to a system, you call the unconference and you get all of the people in the room. So say you wanted to do it on how to run a hospital or a doctor's clinic better, like your own little clinic, 10 people, 100 people. You call the unconference, and perhaps it's the receptionist who comes up and says, well, I think we should have this system for waiting. Or perhaps it's your janitor just saying, this is a really ridiculous way of keeping hygiene. Or maybe it's your CFO saying, well, I really think we should have this form of accounting. Everyone has the right to have these same ideas. They're sort of recorded, and all of the people in the room get to hear it. So it's very, in that sense, democratic, or at least non-hierarchical. You can't get rid of all of the hierarchies completely, but obviously it's much more flat like that. And everyone's ideas gets equal hearing. And so when you put up your sort of timetable, or what it is you want to talk about, people are attracted to the idea that you've said. So again, you've got equality of ideas and agenda setting. It's not just because Mr. Bigwig said they wanted to talk about X. You could go, this junior person, this junior lady had this really interesting idea. Let's go and listen to her.
Got it. Okay, I interrupted you. So I was wondering whether you were going to say theatre.
I was just about to get to theatre, leaving it for the last thing. And then the domain is theatre. So I guess one other way I would introduce myself is say, yeah, I do sustainable investing, and I have done that for 20 over years. But I've also done theatre making and sort of had a dual track with that also for 20 over years.
Because if you Google your name, it says Ben Yeoh. It's pronounced Yeoh, right?
Yeah, it is pronounced Yeoh.
Ben Yeoh, playwright.
Right.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning and talk about how you grew up and your path into finance and theatre. But yeah, I'm particularly interested. I think when I messaged you, I said I want to ask about your time with the remote tribe in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Some of the interesting things you've done. And then also why speaking about autism is important to you, and why speaking about deaths, what you think that's important as well.
Sure.
So, but let's begin at the very beginning with how you grew up.
Sure, and then we can cover travel, autism, death, or whatever you like. So, as I mentioned, I was born in London, and I guess there's a couple of lucky or interesting things around that. So one is with my parents with quite a focus on education. I was quite lucky to go through a scholarship route, so kind of elite London schooling as one blob. But
that's where you got your accent.
Pardon?
Is that where you got your accent?
I guess that's where my accent is quite a sort of London British accent. And then the other thing there is my parents were travel agents, and for them, I picked up very early that to travel was to learn. That they had this idea that you can learn stuff in school and that you had to do and you should do really well and all of that. But actually, there was a really big missing component. Call it the life blob, which you would get from travel. And I guess you're going to get this from travel agents. So we did a lot of those two things. And it's kind of interesting. You get the sort of family aphorisms or little sayings that each family sort of has. And this was definitely one. So there was one around travel, one about food, one about learning and the like.
When did your parents come to London?
So my dad came to the UK in the 1950s, and my mum came in the 70s.
And because both your dad and your grandfather did the same course as you at Cambridge, is that right?
So they actually both did law. I did not do law.
Oh, same college.
Yeah, but we were all three at the same college. Emmanuel at Cambridge. So my grandfather, and I don't have much of this story actually. I've tried to piece it back. I should have asked because my dad died when he was quite young. I never fully asked the full story, but my dad would have been there in my granddad would have been there in the 1930s. And a small piece of the story that I have is he studied law, but he'd already passed the bar exam. So I don't know, in UK law you get called to the bar, and there's a whole other set of exams if you want to be a barrister. But you can kind of take them any time. I don't know if you can do anymore, but basically when you're ready. And he'd already taken and passed them. So he had a really great time at university because he didn't really have to study very much. I'm led to believe. And I think the story would have been that obviously this is a kind of colonial times. There were, and I don't know what the process were, but the British sent back promising locals, call to say, I did that kind of in quote marks, back to the mothership to kind of to be trained up in the British way of doing things. And that would have been from the colony. So this would have been from Malaysia at the time, or Malaya, which was a British colony. And so my granddad had that. And then
purely
my father,
from excelling at school, or?
So that I don't know. I doubt it was purely merit in those days. I think there was a big dose of merit, particularly from the colonies. They were picking up those who thought would do well, but I'm pretty sure they were looking at other things. Although my family wasn't particularly, I think they were kind of from a merchant trading background, so kind of the equivalent of Chinese middle class, I guess, at the time. Although, again, I actually don't know so well back there. And also in those days, because you go back then to the 1800s in Chinese Malaya, it is, very much In the 1800s, you would have taken more than one wife. So you have that whole multiple wives, multiple family lines, and all of that thing. So it gets a little bit complicated.
Do you know when your family came to Malaysia from China?
Not exactly. I think it would have been from Fujian in the early 1800s, very early. So that's about as much as I've gone back there. And then quite a big of Yeoh clan. Actually, I believe originally maybe Hokkien, because of where that is in South China. And in fact, the larger diaspora, there is a much more famous Yeoh, which is Michelle Yeoh, the actor, who's distantly related.
Okay, so your grandfather went over to study at Cambridge and then back to Malaysia.
And then back. And then my father, so then this was very British, in the 1950s, came over to Cambridge. And that certainly was not merit-based, really. That was just my grandfather writing to the then master of Emmanuel and saying, can my son come? And there is this letter that we lost where supposedly the master writes back, who was quite a known character at Emmanuel at the time. Master writes back along the lines of course your son can come as long as he's not going to blow up the Queen. So, in fact, a lot of people in the 1950s, if you could pass quite a low minimum bar, got to go to their old colleges purely on the
legacy.
Strength. Yeah, purely on the strength of the fact that their parents went there, and that, which is why you have a whole 1950s legacy of those who had got there through essentially an aristocratic network effect, or if you'd managed to get there from some other means.
That's so funny. I was at a reunion, a Magdalen dinner recently, and I was the youngest person there, and the oldest person there was there in, he was like 90.
Right.
And he was like, there's no way I would get into Cambridge these days, because it was just
exactly. As a Magdalen Cambridge?
Yeah.
No, and that's exactly right. So my godfather, who's still alive, was one of my great friends of my dad in Emmanuel at that time, was similar. He would not have got in. I don't quite remember or know his story, but it was there. And then, in the 1950s, there weren't even women in most, I think I'd like to say in the 50s in all Cambridge colleges, they had not...
Girton would have existed. There would have been the all-female colleges, but not the mixing.
Not the ones, exactly.
Yeah. My Magdalen was the last one to have women, which I think was the 80s, late 80s.
Was it 80s or something?
Yeah.
So really late, right?
Yeah. So, okay, so your dad came over and studied and then stayed here?
Yeah, and then stayed. Yeah, exactly.
And what was it like as a Malaysian studying at Cambridge at that time?
Oh, so I don't know. So these are my father's stories, really. So I don't. I
Did
don't
he
have
ever
these
share much of that?
Yeah, I don't have these as a clear, set, but certainly, I guess there's a couple of elements. One was, my dad was much more sensitive, essentially, to racism in a way that I don't think I was growing up in London. I didn't really feel it as some people may have felt it or not, and maybe that's the circles and other stuff that I move in. But my dad definitely felt it and had it. So that's one other set. But on the other hand, I think my dad very much threw himself into, I guess, the social life of what it was like in 1950s Cambridge, and had, I think, a touch of entrepreneur about him. So I believe, and some people at the time, although this is going to go into my almost ancient history now, he set up one of the first nightclubs in Cambridge, because I think this was the whole not enough women thing, which I think was called Tropicana, which was people there in the 50s still seem to remember it. So he had a lot of friends and things like that. But then there was, the things like there was sort of curfews, and you had to be back. And there's climbing over walls and things to get in, and things about socializing and when you wear your gowns and high hall and all of that kind of thing. But having come, via having gone to secondary school or via high school in Malaysia, quite a different sort of viable things. And he also talks about, so this is looping back in the travel, which we'll get back to in that. He had stopped off So you had to travel by boat in those days. So to get to Malaysia or Singapore, to London, it was most common to really go by boat. You didn't have the long haul flying really as you do today. So
How long
took weeks, and they stopped off in France because it was going to be quicker, essentially, to drive across France and then pick up the boat to cross over than it was whatever it was. And so he had a big adventure in France, which actually gave him a little bit of love of the continental Europe thing, which I think a lot of people get. Probably double down on our love of food, and then something about travel, about learning how it was. He also gave him a love of driving, which I don't have either. But there was that before getting to London, and then to Cambridge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, let's go back to your path to ending up at Cambridge.
Okay, so I'm going to loop in the travel bit and things if you want. So I'm doing a lot of school stuff, and then I guess one of your questions is as to how this came about. So for me, there were probably 2 or 3 things combining when I was young. So one was this travel blob, and actually having gone to travel quite a lot, and I can talk about a couple of those stories. And then another was being at a school which very much encouraged you to think for yourself, and if you wanted to do something, you just had the resources to do it. And I guess you were encouraged, or I felt encouraged. Some people might not have felt encouraged, but I felt encouraged. But more so is that I wasn't put off. So I would guess, if you use American terminology, I was majoring in sciences, but I was also taking art. And so for A-level, which is the stuff that we do between 16 and 18, I ended up doing double maths, physics, chemistry, and A-level art. And I had to have a unique timetable for that, but I said I wanted to do it. So it was like, fine, if you want to do it, we'll make it work. You might have to work harder and things, and we'll do it. So I spent a lot of time also in the art studio. But I also said, I want to do some play stuff, particularly actually directing at the time. So there was a thing, and I directed some shorts. It was actually Harold Pinter shorts. And then I said, well, I want to do a play. And it was Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which within hindsight is quite a big play to try and take on. But it only had 4 major characters. So that was the other thing. I thought we could do this. So being a very proper school, we applied for the rights, amateur rights, to Edward Albee's London agents, London. And actually they wrote back and said, you can't do this because there's going to be a West End production next year, which is a really big production. So we're not giving out the rights to the play to perform. And I was, as I guess I was 16 around then. So I was an outraged 16-year-old. So it's like, this is completely ridiculous. How is like a few night performance of a play in a school where like essentially just your parents and family turn up ever going to impinge on ticket sales for a West End show next year? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And so I felt I wrote letters and I hadn't thought about it. So I thought, well, you know what? They're the agents. I'll just write to Edward Albee. I'm sure he'll be really sensible. So I wrote him a letter saying a little bit of who I am, wanted to do on a play, and then to say, I think probably quite politely, how ridiculous his London agents were. Didn't really think that much about it, but I thought it out. And just 2 or 3 weeks later, Edward Albee wrote back and said, yeah, you're completely right. Sure, put on the play. Wish you all the best of it. And amazing. So that was that. So I had a really good interaction. And later on, I was told that Edward Albee is known for sometimes being a little bit of a difficult character, and people are surprised that it was kind of such a warm and things letter. So I suspect this is it. This is how you approach people and how things happen. And I guess that turned out successful. But it echoes then 2 or 3 things which really come to mind. One is that if you want something to happen, you can, if you think you've got a reasonable thing, then you've kind of got to make it happen. And writing a letter isn't very difficult. There seems to be a big energy barrier to do it, but I still write letters today, still to sometimes really important people, and I get a lot of replies. So if you write someone a personal letter in a really kind of reasonable way, then you did that. I actually have some unsent letters as well, which I somewhat regret. I had like something like 18 unwritten letters to John Berger, which I never sent, and then he died. So they're now will be never sent. But they were maybe, sometimes letter writing is more for yourself than for the recipient. But in any case, so Edward Albee said yes, and that put me on the path. But there was a little bit on that. And then making theatre is really interesting because, so there's a lot of chat today, this is more recent thoughts, there's a lot of chat today about, how to hack life, how to hack growth, what are the kind of routines that you need to do, wake up at 5 a.m, do yoga or have bullet shot coffee or whatever, these kind of little so-called hacks for life. And what kind of theatre teaches you is that there is no hack for life, right? No one little thing like can make something which is really brilliant like that. And being in a place where obviously grades and that type of thing, exams, there's a reasonable value to them, I had quite a few very strong countervailing forces saying the grades aren't really the thing, the grades aren't really that important. Making the piece of theatre was equally, if not more important. And interestingly, making the piece of theatre is harder. It was much harder to put on what I thought was a pretty decent showing of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf than it was going to get A stars in maths. And the effort that you need to put on a piece of theatre, you it's just impossible to do that without a reasonable amount, probably weeks of rehearsal. You just can't put on a piece of theatre without that. There is no real hack to doing that, and it's really valuable.
So how did you figure that out? That was important.
Just so the fact that I wanted to put on the play, and so I guess it started from a small piece. But if you want to put on like a 2-hour play and the things, it's like, well, how do you build back to do it? You can't do that without rehearsals.
But how did you realize? Because I guess I'm probably gone about life the opposite. That I realized, it's how do you get? I did maths as well. How do you get good marks in maths? It's like you follow a formula. Like you learn how to make sure you ace the exam, and it's not that it's just a formula. But to go out and do stuff where there's no guarantee that you'll be good. There's no formula. Like me doing this podcast, it's so scary, right? If you're someone who's used to being like, if I follow a formula, I can get 100%. But there's no formula. And that is important, but it's taken me, and some people probably never realize that in their life and might, because I guess it requires vulnerability to say, I'm going to do something and it's going to be hard and it might be rubbish.
Yeah. So I guess that's the point I'm making, that to realize that grades aren't the thing. You can get grades by the formula, and essentially you work hard, and you might have some hacks in the sense of, like, if I know what questions are coming up, I could just remember them and you repeat them out. But the important thing was to realize that the grades weren't going to be that helpful for doing well in life, or being happy in life, or feeling fulfilled.
So how did you realize that?
So it was these combination of things. So theatre was one element, which was telling me that. So another element was this element of travel. So the first couple of times I travelled by myself, I was, for today's age, seemingly relatively young. Although having said that, just this week I had a business trip to Zurich, and I saw there was probably a 12 to 14-year-old traveling by himself just in front of me in the queue. So it still does happen, interestingly. But the first couple of times I traveled by myself, I was about 14 and went to San Francisco and stayed with some family friends. And then I was 16 and went to East Malaysia, Borneo, went to Kinabalu, and traveled around myself, those things as well as probably 2 or 3 times a year, either doing Southeast Asian travel with my family or European travel as well. And so I guess by the time even I was 17 or 18, I'd been to, 20, 30, maybe 40 countries or places, all very all very different. And then I'd already had 2 or 3 then quite formative experiences traveling by yourself with not any particular goal. So when I was in San Francisco when I was 14, I didn't have a particular purpose. I was just there as a travel holiday. And then I was with family friends, but they were the kind of family friends we hadn't seen as a family for over 10 years. So we didn't know each other very well, but I wasn't in a hotel, so I had somewhere to be there in the night. But during the day, they were like, well, we're working. You just do whatever it is you want to do. So we were staying out in the suburbs of Palo Alto, and I took the then Caltrain into San Francisco as commuters do. And then you realize, like, I'm in a, big city, kind of one of the greatest cities in the world. And I could do anything with a budget of not very much. And so what is it you do? Like, you have to make all of the decisions. You have to sort of see what are you going to get out of this. And then having to make those kind of decisions early, what is it you do? What's risky? What's not risky? Not in terms of risk, or, what is it you really want to learn? And that kind of independence really fosters some of that element. And then similarly, when I was 16, did you want to jump in with something there?
Was it your idea, or like how did you end up going to San Fran?
Yeah, I guess so. I was reasonably nudged by my parents. They were saying, well, we're busy working. If you want to do something this summer, why don't you do some travel? And then it was like, well, what could you do? So I could have gone. And in fact, I think when I was 12, I spent some time with my family in Singapore, but that was kind of family and that was Singapore. And they were like, oh, well, we have some family friends in San Francisco. You could do that. And I was like, yeah, okay.
And are you an only child?
Yes, I am an only child.
And did you enjoy yourself, as you can remember?
As an only child, or
no,
going to San Francisco?
Going traveling on your own.
Oh yeah, yes. So again, there were a lot of things. So having then done a lot of travel younger with my parents, wasn't scared at all by the infrastructure of flying, and it was easier in those days. So in those days, for instance, I almost certainly, up until the age of 12, almost every single big flight would go to the cockpit, and say hello to the pilot, and you're walking around. And in my very early days of flying, I still have memories of people smoking in planes, and I'm like, oh, we don't, that's a bit smelly and stuff, and things like that. And then actually you had you were an unaccompanied minor, so I think you still have this today. Someone would take you through, or they would meet you, and airline people that. And I remember at least one sitting next to a lady, and we're playing cards, and I don't remember it, but she told me her life story, just because this is a little bit when you're a little bit other or just different, and I guess younger person those days, and you're willing to be a little bit open, which I guess as a 14-year-old and being quite chatty. What was I chatty? I was of normal chattiness. You just speak to people, which then comes this kind of conversation, and you just then learn about the world and the people. And then I guess you're not particularly with some sort of agenda. And it's a bit intriguing. It's like, oh, what are you doing traveling by yourself? And so that was one thing. And so then that is feeding into this blob. So to have great life experiences, you have to kind of make your own decisions and make your own way in the world. There isn't particularly, hacks to conversation, although I guess there are a couple of things, but, the ability to talk to people and to do that and to learn about the world. So that's one blob going into this. And then another blob, so this was a family friend, and he was an artist, Ibrahim Hussein. And he didn't visit so often, maybe once a year, once every other year, although we went to see them in Malaysia as well. So this was a family friend that my dad had made in the early 60s or maybe late 50s here in London. He'd gone to art school here I'm sure. But he was a practicing artist, was making money as a Malaysian artist. And he was so we were all talking about art, and we had his art on the wall, and there were some occasions. One occasion I remember where he essentially kind of demanded paint brushes and material. We didn't have any, so we went to the local hardware shop and essentially got wallpaper because he wanted big canvases, and he spent the whole weekend painting. Essentially, he was inspired, and nothing else could get in the way of the fact that he wanted to paint, and he did it essentially on our living room floor. So seeing someone who was dedicated to an art and craft or a creative practice, seeing that it could be successful, also seeing it in motion, like, this is it. You just and also I guess I remember it because how hard is it? It's like, oh, do you have the things? Well, all it needed some wallpaper, 2 brushes, and some paints, not even very good paints. I think they even came from the hardware shop as well. And he painted some extraordinary things from that. And so that was quite influential as well, not being a normal science track. And that's probably the reason, in fact, that was a core reason for doing A-level art as well as GCSE art, what we do at 16 and 18. So there was a big blob of that. And then do you want to say
Were
something?
you good at art? I guess I want to ask, at what point did you realize you were very bright? I mean, clearly you're very bright. I think, did you top your course at Cambridge?
So I did in my little Tripos area. So Cambridge is a little bit funny, but I did get the top first in my Tripos. Yeah, so in one sense, I was on scholarships from very young. In the sense of getting grades, that was realised very young. But at the same point in time, probably around the same time, probably because being told to travel is to learn in this art, I think that it was, I wouldn't have necessarily had the words for it, but that kind of intelligence was probably broadly overrated by the people who have that kind of intelligence. So it's a little bit tricky because to say like, oh, if you're kind of average or whatever, then having these kind of smarts in terms of a crystallized IQ or memory or things like that obviously has some advantages, right? If you can remember lots of stuff easily and recall them, it makes lots of aspects of the way we live life today easier. So in that sense, you can't say that type of intelligence isn't worth anything. But if you have lots of that type of intelligence and you think, well, that's the only important thing and that's going to get me around in life, and or this is intersectional with the grades thing, because with that sort of intelligence, it's quite easy to form the formula and get high marks in maths or whatever it is in algebra. But is that doing well in life, or is that leading to satisfaction and fulfillment and all of these other things? And it was quite obvious to me with these other inputs of life, so travel and art and theatre, and I'll come along to a couple of others, that wasn't necessarily flourishing is what it meant to flourish as a human. It was obviously a part of it. And so that I came to also quite early on, that saying there's these other things where book smarts aren't gonna help you.
But you must have always realized, like, it was a given that you'd get into a top university. And because I'm trying to understand, like, were you also very good at art? Because a lot of people, I guess, would see that, because it seems like how education works, and maybe this is why you're interested in, like, changing how we think about it. But it's like a game. It's like, how do I win the game? Well, that's the platform for life, right? How do I get a good job? Get into a good university. I mean, if you're going to do that type of job, get into a good university. How do I get into a good university? Get good marks. How do I do that? Like, do the stuff I'm good at. Whereas, like, doing something different that you enjoy is kind of a risk. But were you also, like, really excelling at art? And then I'm wondering, did you realize you were quite unique? Because people tend to be kind of, in the, I don't know, maybe it was different at your school, but it's like you have people who are good at maths and those type of subjects over here, and then you have more like humanities people, and then, and people kind of stick to those things. Whereas being very good at maths and also very good at art seems quite unique.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of a complicated answer, and I'll try and also remember to come back to a couple of other blobs. So the short answer was I wasn't very good at art. I don't think. But by doing more art, I definitely improved. So I would have said my art was average for a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. Maybe there's some above average aspects because I did a reasonable amount of it, and an average person in art is not curious and interested in doing more art. So there's a little bit more to it than that. But I met now a couple of children who definitely are way better than I was at art and are more engaged and are doing even more art than what I was. But I spent a significant amount of time. In fact, I feel almost certain I did more time on A-level art than I did in double maths. Although there was probably a little bit more timetable time for maths, particularly outside of that. You know, if you can solve quadratic equations, you can solve quadratic equations. It doesn't need that much more time. If you want to do a self-portrait, I spent a whole term doing hours and hours of various versions of self-portraits, which was our art project at the time. But I was slowly improving, and there were definitely better people than me at art at the time. In fact, there were some people, and this is the problem in improving, there was a couple of people, one person in the year above me, whose art I thought was also quite good, but sort of not necessarily brilliant, who's gone on to be an A-tier British young British artist, and his art has improved. And so this is the thing about the putting effort at something and getting it better. And that's the same for theatre. Although actually I thought Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf we put on pretty well, and it came out pretty good for a bunch of secondary schoolers, for high schoolers. Having said that, I did a lot also at the time of photography, of black and white photography, and it was probably true to say that my photography art was very good at the time. But that was, I think, flowing from the fact that I traveled a lot and was observational. So my standard visual art was average-ish, but improving. My photographic art was very good, I think. Broadly, more or less. Theatre is harder to say, but certainly my creative writing, which I was also doing little bits of, not writing plays in particular, was probably only average to below average. Nothing particularly special, I don't think, at the time. Although I guess wanting to write it and practicing writing it does say something.
And what kind of idea did you have about the direction your life would take while you're in school?
So I guess I still wasn't particularly sure. I definitely wanted to pursue more of the science type stuff and also more of the arts type stuff. So those things were important to me. And also my family wasn't particularly wealthy, so there was definitely something where I wanted to have a stable life. I didn't think I was just going to be let's just try and do art if it wasn't going to ever be able to have something stable in family life. And I think a little bit of that was also looking still at the time, a lot of great artists who had done really well had quite a support network around them. There were some who actually had just struggled through, but it was a kind of minority. And I probably didn't quite fancy that for myself, to be fair. And I guess the other blob at the time, to finish that up, is my dad got cancer when I was a teenager, and it went into remission and then came back when I was a late teen. And I guess this element of coming close to death early on probably was a factor. I can't particularly parse it now, but it did leave me with another outlook on life, knowing that life was fragile, and then having gone to some very poor places in the world, and really seeing up front close. Not only is it fragile because you could get cancer at any time and be hit by a bus in rich nations, but you go to poorer places, which is still kind of the majority of the world, I guess, and just everything about life is fragile. You go to places which don't have running water, who are thinking about where their next meal will come from, and it gives you a very different outlook on life. And so putting those things together, it was also, well, what is it you want to do? What is it you want to spend your time on? And I guess there's a little element of that which then stayed with me, developed through school, and goes all the way till, say, today, where, for instance, I don't spend too much time watching something like Netflix, because there is a little bit like of me is like, do I really want to spend the hours that I have watching this particular thing on Netflix, or do I want to spend it doing time with family, with friends, reading, writing, whatever it is that I might also want to do? And at the margin, when you're feeling a bit tired, or when there's like a little energy hump to do whatever this thing is versus something else which is maybe easier but less fulfilling, that I've developed a stronger habit to do the more fulfilling thing, even if it takes a little bit more of an energy hump. And usually, although it takes an energy hump, the thing itself is actually gives you more energy. It's more fulfilling to do. It generally is more fulfilling to have a conversation with friends than it is to watch a random thing on Netflix. Now, there might be good other things you might want to watch on Netflix and stuff, so I'm not saying don't spend zero time on Netflix, but at the margin, if you want to like have any sort of conversation with friends that you want, or read a book you've been really meaning to book, or just a random thing that you just switch on the internet, that other thing, that conversation with friends is going to be more valuable to you. So what are the factors within that? And I think developing that ethos goes a little bit to having grown up in those elements, which I guess is travel, creative arts, crossing humanities and science, family, and then also having come close to death earlier on.
How old were you when your dad passed away?
So my dad died when I was 19, if I remember correctly. 19 or 20. I think I was 19.
So that's when you were at...
So that's when
when
I was
you were
at
Cambridge.
That's what I was
Did
at Cambridge.
you have a close friend pass away as well? Or did I
Yeah,
know?
so I had one of my best friends died when I was, well, it was a year before, more or less. I forget exactly when it's like 17, 18, 19. I have a December birthday. So I went to university when I was 17. I left Cambridge when I was 20. So my dad would have died when I was 20, 19, 20, that borderline. So I was slightly younger than average even for the time. But that was only because I was kind of a December baby.
And what kind of impact did it have on you?
So my dad dying or my best friend dying?
I guess both.
So dad dying has a longer arc because he had already been ill when I was, say, about 14, had cancer of the back of the tongue, had surgery, and so was in remission, and then it came back sort of 5 years later. So that was a longer arc. And so the beginning arc was a little bit of don't waste your time, death, fragile, and then the traveling, which you can loop back in with some of that. My best friend dying was also a little bit of that, but there was another interesting couple of other effects, which was almost everyone around us of our peer group, so these 18 or 19-year-olds, I think I'd like to say everyone, but almost everyone in particular, hadn't encountered death at all at that stage, which I now know was not how we thought of death, say, 100 years ago, but it certainly seems to be of death today. And more or less, you could say they didn't really know how to react, and quite a few of them probably did not react at, say, an optimum levels. And that was quite interesting because a lot of them weren't particularly like friends with her. Like in university, you have some people who just sort of pass, and a lot of them obviously took it really, really deeply. That, and everyone, I guess, as an aphorism, I think now that everyone actually processes grief in their own sort of ways. But that was one thing.
How did she die?
So she had a background of lupus, but had actually died of septicemia. And that's actually a really interesting question when we now ask, how does someone die? Because, for instance, you could say that my dad died of lung cancer in the end, even though it started with cancer at the back of the tongue. And therefore, you could say that he died because in the 50s and 60s, he was a smoker. So you could say, well, did he die of smoking? But all of those were actually offshoots of kind of having quite a good life. So in some ways, he was dying because he was living. And so when you talk about Nadia, when he says, well, she died of septicemia with this background of lupus, which is a kind of autoimmune disease. But broadly speaking, she had never really let the disease dictate her life. More or less, she did. There's sensible things when you have such a disease that you kind of don't do. But at the margin, she was definitely living life to the full. She helped me produce a play. We were doing stuff together, and it's kind of there's some other things around it where you might get unlucky and things. But she was really, you would have definitely have said, living life to the full. So in some aspects of it, there was an undercurrent. With that. So the first order is like, oh yeah, you died of septicemia, you died in an accident, and some of these. But there's some other second order things I now think about when it's like, well, how does someone die? But at least the physical aspect was, blood poisoning.
I guess when I ask that question, it's kind of, was it suicide or was it an accident, unexpected, or was it a illness?
So it was neither that. So I guess it's sort of illness, but it was still unexpected. Except that she was training to be a doctor, so as a medic, you kind of know, and she would know she was at higher risk of these type of things. But even so, you're at higher risk, but still relatively small absolute risk. You wouldn't have expected it to happen at any point in time.
Yeah. So how did you cope then?
I did more of the things that I was doing, more or less. So I was doing science. So I was doing even more science, and then I was doing a lot of theatre, and I didn't stop doing both because I was enjoying it, and also if you could die at any time for things like that, why stop at the point you want to die? You want to still have been living life to the full. I guess there was a whole other element of processing philosophy and spirituality and whatever those type of things were as well. But that had probably been a continuous thing from having been younger, also having already started processing those type of things. So I remember as an early teen reading things like C.S. Lewis has a great little book called A Grief Observed, when his wife died and he'd converted to Christianity. So it was a really big thing for him that he had a lot of faith, and then this tragic thing happened to him. So it's a quite short set of essays, so much more famous for the Narnia books, but an interesting thinker, broadly speaking. So when I read that as quite young, obviously coming with that, and so echoes of some of those things. So then there are now many more memoirs and things like that, but for an early one, people often come to that, and that is quite a thing. And then I also remember, probably as a mid-teen, somewhere between 14 and 16, reading Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, and things of that. So processing these type of things, and then other esoteric things. I remember reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Living and Dying, and stuff like that. The fact that there was a lot of things we can't really understand very well, which is a more humanities thing. Although you end up, this is interesting, when you take science quite far, or maybe not even necessarily far, you find at the edge of science where you also don't really understand a lot of things. And so I started developing like a lot of overlaps. Why does trying to describe quantum physics seem much more like poetry? And why does like studying consciousness seem to be much more of the philosophy of mind? So all of these things at the edge of what we understand as being human, when you take them there, not about the grades, about trying to understand these things. So then Nadia dying, my friend, was part of that, and part of thinking about all of those type of things.
And did you have these type of conversations in your family about philosophy and spirituality?
No, actually, not really with my family. I was lucky enough to have had a conversation with my dad somewhere in between about how he felt about death, but not a very deep one, things one, but just this idea that he didn't want to be brain dead and still living. So we managed to have that as an important small conversation, but actually not. And occasionally with friends, but I probably processed a little bit more through reading and writing myself. But some conversations was not. We're not a family which had like deep philosophical questions around dinner. Dinner was much more around about food, and where you could find good things to eat, what we should eat next, how we thought about food, which was like another big theme in our life, like the importance of food and what it means culturally and all of that. So that's another other parallel big blob.
Mm-hmm. And how did your mom cope?
She really likes routines, and some of the routines of stuff like that. So she was still a travel agent working in house. And then actually when my dad died, I went away to Harvard for a year. So I think that routine of work stuff was very important to her.
Yeah, because she would have missed you as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so at what point did you go and spend time with the Wana tribe?
So the Wana tribe, so these were in the middle of the travel. So the big travels, 14 roughly, San Francisco, Kinabalu, East Malaysia, roughly when I was 16. Then India was 17, 18. So around about 18 plus or minus a year. So probably the year before my dad died, I was in Sulawesi, Indonesia. So Sulawesi in Indonesia, if you look at it on the map, it looks a little bit like a squashed starfish, and is one of the least visited islands of Indonesia because the beaches of Bali and the other stuff are kind of more famous on the tourist trail. But Sulawesi itself is a really fascinating island. The Dutch had kind of rediscovered it probably the late 1800s, early 1900s, and so there's a little bit of influence from that. But there'd been a couple of cultures there way back before that. In fact, in the middle of Sulawesi, around an area, I think it's called the Barda Valley, and near a village town called Rantapau, there are a set of monoliths or statues which remind people of the ones on Easter Island, although they're a little bit smaller. And no one knows anything about the culture which left those monoliths. So it's a little bit like Stonehenge in England. They don't even know how they were made, where even the stone came from, or anything about them. So the culture which is there today doesn't know anything around what that other culture was. So you've got a lot of spots of the Sulawesi which is around that. Anyway, that's kind of in the middle of Sulawesi. Now, if you travel east of that place, there is some primary rainforest jungle. So this is some of the oldest rainforest still in the world. Primary, it hasn't really gone back. Secondary in here, and in this primary rainforest, there lives some semi-nomadic tribes still, and one of those tribes are the Wana tribe, or their set. And when I went to go and visit them in the 1990s, they had, I think the stories I had told, had only relatively recently made contact with people outside of the rainforest. So they were coming to start trading, and I think only around 10 or so years earlier they had still been wearing kind of bark clothing and very much been living their life in the rainforest. But a series of things meant there was kind of interacting with the nearest town, which was still a kind of 2-day. They didn't really go out. I can't remember. We trekked 2 or 3 days to get to where they were, and you'd had to take a boat ride to the entrance of the river for getting to where they were. So that's the kind of background for the Wana.
How did you find out about them? Why did you decide to go?
So there was a tiny section in our guidebook, and then when we were deciding, let's go and see the Barda Valley, and actually around there, just to the south, there's a place which has really massive festivals based around funerals. Interestingly, buffalo sacrifices and things. We were deciding, in fact, there was a bit to go and travel across somewhere else. But we thought this sounded really interesting. And I guess there was a little bit of, it was very much off the beaten path. There were probably only tens of people who had gone to go and do this visit. I think even now you might get into like a couple of hundred, but there's not that many people who go and visit. Although I just saw on the internet a picture of the kind of chief who is the same chief that I met. So you can see the picture. I've got one of him 20 years younger, which was quite a throwback, saying like, oh my God, I know that person. Anyway, and so that was a little bit around this. It was a challenge. It's like, okay, this is really interesting. But they were also open. So there's lots of things about, particularly the ones in Latin America, like the idea is that you don't make contact. If they haven't come and make contact, then sort of ethically speaking, you leave them to do their thing. And then there's a little more issues around logging and stuff like that. But this was a tribe which had been open to making contact and essentially trade and that. So we thought, well, this was an opportunity, and probably one which would never really be repeated either, unless you're going to kind of be a social anthropologist or the like. So we decided to do it. Oh, we also met a guide. So I'm probably today you're out, but there were only, I think there's pretty much only one guide who could take you there at that time
through the jungle
to meet them and had a relationship with them. I think there were other sort of non-profits who were obviously interacting. In fact, it made such an impression. I remember his name today, or his at least Christian name was Manuel, and part of the payment, so we paid part in cash, but part of it was we gave him a watch to trade. My travel companion had a watch that she wanted to trade out and didn't want, which was a kind of fancy Swiss type of watch, not that fancy, but something which you couldn't get. And so that was an interesting thing. So to see the Wana, there was no point bringing money. Money was not meaningful to them, but actually bringing even just aspirins and actually what we would think of very basic things was extremely valuable for them. And in fact, those were the things that we traded for our night's stay as gifts. So things that they couldn't readily get, and they weren't getting, and they didn't really have a low supply. So that was the one thing about actually going there. First of all, it's just how tough it was, like living in the jungle. So in one sense, one notion you have is a kind of romantic hunter-gatherer, having a lot of spare time, chatting around, telling stories and playing. And like there is a small element of that, but also there's a huge other element of just how tough it is. You need to get enough food to last you through the next few days. You might not have that food supply. The women were constantly at work. So one of their main sources essentially of the carbohydrate thing was a kind of cassava root, which actually tasted awful. They laughed when I asked to taste some, and it was really bitter. You could make it less bitter, but it was just not something you'd really want to eat every day. But to prepare it took hours and hours of work a day. And then when they were out, if you got an injury, you're at really risk of infection. And if you caught infection, you're talking about astronomical, like 50% chance of dying from things like infections like that. So on the other hand, your life is also really, really hard, even though you might have these times. And then, what is it to be bored, or what is it to be in play or not? All of these type of things. And then, so they were based at that time. So they're semi-nomadic. They kind of take a base for a while, and then will move their base. So they're not someone who travels all the time. So they were next to the river, but there was no running water. There were no things like toilets or things like that. Actually, we slept in something which was only semi enclosed. And so getting back, so you can have this, right? So you can go wild camping and stuff, and you bring your tent and whenever it is. But these are people who their whole lives are like that, and they don't have tenting equipment. They don't have things which make your water disease free or whatever. So running water, so that was that. And so it is quite impactful living amongst something like that.
And so they're just able to drink the water. But for you, because I read the blog you wrote on it, and it's like you've come and got your water purification tablets and whatever. But is that just because if you grow up like drinking this water, you'll be fine?
I think they boiled their water, if I recall correctly. I imagine they have a higher and it was running water in the middle of the jungle, so it is cleaner. And in fact, that's the thing. So like, also within small things. So if you're throwing things in the river, then it's pushing it downstream so that you don't have it. But I think they were mostly drinking boiled water, even still in case, even though I'm pretty sure they had higher resistance to some of the things. And I think we drank boiled water, but I think maybe there were probably instances where we were also boiled water, but also with water purification, because you do not want to get one of those diseases out there. Actually, getting a disease like that out there in the middle of the jungle, you might not be able to come back. There wouldn't necessarily be anyone who could come and get you, and if you couldn't get out on your own power, and you were seriously ill, that was probably game over.
And because you wouldn't have really had any way to communicate back at that point. You wouldn't have
had
a phone,
that's true,
right?
Actually. There were no mobile phones were about, but for instance, to say it at the time, when I was at university, probably even then, maybe only 1 out of 3 people had mobile phones, or maybe 1 out of 5. I didn't at that time, or even at university. In fact, my first year of university, I remember not everyone had email. So everyone, like some people did, and everyone then signed up and got this email thing. But it was the first. I'm in that in between year where the internet had really started, but it was that. So I'm part digital, part analog. Some stuff is really still analog, and so in fact, I was probably beneficial. So I took a notebook sketchbook, and people still do that. But today, I think a lot of it would probably be electronic. And maybe you bring your Kindle or your phone. But yeah, it was completely analog. In fact, I'm not even. Would I bring my phone? I guess I would bring my phone, but I'd be really nervous. Like, just, it's very hot, it's very humid, it's not particularly hospitable. You could easily just fall in a bit of, I don't know, river or wetness or whatever. But yeah, I guess you would.
You're probably not getting phone reception though in the
jungle. Oh no! Although I think now with Starlink and some other stuff, you might be able to. But yeah,
That's what I was going to ask with your letter writing. Do you do handwritten letters, or it's mostly emails?
So I almost always write for my letters the first version out by hand. That's also sometimes because I draw in them still a little bit, and because of the slower process as it is. But I don't necessarily recommend it. So I think for writing and typing, you need to match that. So I've now spoken to a couple of people. So in fact, I did a podcast with someone called Joanne Limburg, who's autistic, who's a writer. And when she finally moved to all typing, it much suited her better because her speed of thoughts matches her typing. And Tyler Cowan, who's an economist who also runs a podcast, I know he can barely write anymore because he only types, and that sets his mindset. But some other people like the process which I do, of sometimes hand to brain, and that writing process, and that might be a little bit because I'd done more art making or craft making when younger, and still do some. So there's something about that pathway which suits me.
But I mean, the Virginia Woolf letter, was that handwritten?
I haven't written one to Virginia Woolf. That Joanne Lindbergh has written to Virginia Woolf.
Edward
Albee on Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Yeah, that was handwritten, and he wrote handwritten back. But that was in that was around 1994. So word processing had come in, but for instance, we wouldn't have had a printer at home, and a lot of places wouldn't have. And I don't even think necessarily my school would have had. No, my school must have had a printer. But what
would you have had email though?
I don't think he had email. We wouldn't have had email.
Huh. Okay.
Would I have? I don't know. I think around about that time I might have got an email address, but it was still. I don't know. Does it dial-up broadband? That's how you connected to the internet.
Yeah, I mean, so, I'm old enough to remember.
Right.
Okay.
Anyway, so the one I haven't quite finished off. So that was that. So being that, and then living among that, and the whole stories and the whole thing. So seeing that, so the reality of it was neither that romantic, but there were some things that, and also that, but then also the wishes and dreams. So I did ask, sort of through translation, like, would you ever move out of this village? And some of the answers were, kind of, but why? Or we don't know anything were for that. But cotton clothes were valuable. They were they lasted longer and they were better than the bark clothing and stuff. And then just a couple of years before, I'd spent a little bit of time on essentially an open cast gold mine in Borneo in East Malaysia near Mount Kinabalu. And that was really interesting. Also going through some of the nearby villages and kampongs where, so we, I had this view, why don't children just go to school kind of thing. And then I remember speaking to a 14-year-old there who actually at the time, so was almost my age. I was 16. And they're just saying like, I'm really annoyed that I can't go to work at the mine until essentially international standards, right? 18 and all of this type of stuff. Because it's the best opportunity there. I would earn more. I could do stuff for my village and my family if I could work at this mine, and I'm not allowed to, and that's like really unfair. And I had never read. I found I was like, oh my god, that was someone who I thought I could relate to, and in some ways could do, which had completely the opposing world view. So the world view coming from a rich nation where obviously there's other opportunities like education and things like that, where it would be awful to think about a 14-year-old going down a mine or a coal mine if we would have them there. Then speaking to that actual 14-year-old in somewhere like East Malaysia, in what was obviously a really poor village. Again, no real running water and all of this. And then understanding like, actually, I could get that. That mine would earn you more money and more opportunity than almost anything else. And we're kind of saying that you can't do it for reasons like that. Again, I didn't know where necessarily to sit on that debate, but the elements of that, traveling and meeting someone and having their actual life experience, and then being such an opposite idea to what my 16-year-old self would have thought, and then just dwelling on it and that. And I think there is then something still really important about these in-person meetings. In fact, there's a branch of philosophy around this, that there is still something a little bit special about when humans meet other humans. And actually you can see it sometimes with animals. I think I spoke to someone where they looked into the eyes of a crow and they said that I can definitely see consciousness because of that, because of an interperson thing that you don't get even from movies or reading about something. And traveling and being on their own terms and hearing their story and why they think where they do is still really impactful, and I think can change people's minds in a way that actually a more ordinary day-to-day discourse does not.
Yeah, but we can also do that like within our own communities. It's something
we can. Yeah, for sure.
Do And that's what I mean. That's literally why I do this podcast, because there's so much division. I noticed it at Cambridge first. It's like people are just like yelling things, and they're not actually listening to the person sat next to them. And like, how do we like slow down and have conversations and understand that person's view? Like, they didn't come up with it just to piss you off. Like, it came from somewhere. And if you take time to understand who a person is, what their values are, where they came from, we might be able to move forward together and figure out whatever everyone's upset about.
Totally agree.
Okay, cool. So how did you think about travel at that point? It was just like, you want to, because going from San Fran on the first trip to then East Malaysia, India, then seeing this tribe, it's like, what were you thinking? Like, how were you?
So here, I guess there's this big dose of what everyone's calling curiosity, and this sort of overused phrase of kind of follow your curiosity or that. But there is something to it. And I'm not sure whether it's a teachable thing. I kind of think it still is. But there is something around just really wanting to know how other people think, why they think, and how the world is really working, say, in the minds of humans, or maybe with fundamental laws of aspects of physics or maths or whatever. And there was definitely that some urge, having then seen how so many different types of people live, and their worldviews, or even just their day-to-day life. So in San Francisco, it's not necessarily a dramatically different worldview, but just a very different day-to-day life, the construction of even cities or travel, or how you eat, or what you eat, and all of that type of stuff was definitely a driving factor. And when just every day of being is, and almost every moment is then something new or something to take in, is at least at that time, and still is kind of enormously satisfying. So rather than thinking of like a small tactical day to day of where you are, and even the small tactical things have things like, oh, so what you're going to eat for lunch, where you're going to get lunch, how you decide that suddenly becomes a little bit of an adventure. Now, the downside is then there's a lot of choices and things to make, but the upside is it's completely new, and there might be something different to it, and something which might increase your understanding of anything. And then also, I mean, at that time, and I think it's probably still true today, but in many of those places, you're obviously other, different, a traveller, and then those interactions are, so you have all of these random conversations. I remember in Sulawesi, Indonesia, once they could get their heads around the fact that I was kind of British but looked kind of Chinese or Japanese. They hadn't met that many Chinese, so it was more Japanese travelers. And it's just like, oh, so you're British, okay. And then so once that was there, almost the second other question was, so have you met Princess Diana, and what do you think of her? So there's kind of these other conversations that you wouldn't have, because at the time of that, she was such an icon for even like not quite the Wana tribe, but one step removed in that. Conversations would be around that, and then all of these other day-to-day just things, how you get around, and then they would tell, then when you have these conversations, it's like, oh, is that how much something costs in London, which would be incredible to them, and how you bargain or not bargain, and just all of these, how you live your life becomes really fascinating if you're traveling in that fashion.
So you're obviously very courageous, or knew how to deal with people, because you're going to these places where it's like you have to figure out how much stuff costs on you, to make sure you're not being ripped off or end up in a dangerous situation, or like, how do I get from the airport to wherever I'm going?
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as courageous, really. And I think my worldview on that is, so there are obviously dangers and things, but the vast majority of the time with the vast majority of people are pro-social. This is not always the case, so you do have to be on your guard. But weirdly, you probably have to be in your guard more on high trust communities, actually, because it's more likely that you get something forward when you expect it to be high trust. It's just to do with expectations.
Like being robbed in Spain. on.
Yeah. Well,
stuff
so in
like
fact,
that.
there's more fraud in places like Sweden because they are high trust things. They expect people, and so like in Switzerland, everyone expects you to just have an honesty system for their public transport. They wouldn't ever dream of not paying for a ticket, and therefore they don't check. Therefore, if you wanted to, as a kind of traveler with no money, get around the Swiss system, it'd be enormously easy because no one really checks for that because it's high trust. So those are the other kind of things. But so there are then common things which even locals would do, right? Don't flash easy, hold lots of money out in your hand for it to be stashed is just, that temptation for things, even if it's not someone who wants to be a criminal, would be a really large temptation not to put in your place for things like that. So yes, but getting around, maybe once you've done it once or twice, it's not that hard. So for instance, to begin with, you can just ask people. And normally if you ask people, they are helpful wherever they are. And not everyone, maybe you can get a bit unlucky, but then if you ask up to 5 people, I'm like 95% sure you'll get that. And then they want to even tell you, like, you know what, you shouldn't take the bus. I wouldn't take the bus if I were you because too dangerous, too slow, too expensive. And they say, well, I'd recommend, if it was me, I'd take the train or whatever. It's like, oh, you don't know what you're doing. Just take a taxi, but don't take those taxis. Take these taxis. And maybe you might have it in a guidebook, but you could just ask someone. And if you're then very cautious, you ask a couple of people. And then if they say the same thing independently, and then, you're at a restaurant or whatever, you could just... So some of it is just you're asking knowledge. Picking up, I think it must be really... So I haven't done this kind of travel for a little bit, but now that you've got translation apps and language, it must be even easier. But at the time, I always kind of picked up a little bit of pidgin language. They're always really entertained if you try and speak a little bit of their language, even though English is kind of everyone's second language, almost more like, except for the Wana, where we had real trouble, where that actually is not that we definitely had to go through a guide. It might be different now. But yeah, just that open-mindedness. There is something slightly special still in most people's minds about that status as a traveler, and in out-of-the-way communities. And that's because a lot of cultures still have a hospitality type of culture, because it was very important to them over history, both the trade and stories that travelers brought. Not quite the same in things, but even still with that, traveling historically through very difficult places like even Afghanistan. It's a bit different today, but they would have had that with the Silk Road and the hospitality of traveler, and you were meant to be treated in a certain way.
But I guess that does take courage and vulnerability to go up to a stranger and reveal something about yourself. But did you just never had a problem doing that?
I guess not. I still don't think it takes that much courage or vulnerability. But I guess, that's from my own worldview.
Maybe that's an only child thing, that it's like you have to practice speaking to people outside your kind of...
Yeah, I guess tribe. It does. But because I think if you think about it at the level up, like even just logically, rationally, as opposed to that, like what is it that you're actually losing? The answer is almost nothing. In fact, nothing. And what is it you're gaining? The worst case is nothing, and the best case is a lot. So like the rational mind comes to the fact that it's almost always in favor of conversation, and is almost always in favor of maybe even talking about your worldview, but certainly asking about someone else's. And I think the only things which might hold us back then are the other cultural and environmental trainings which suggest that it could be dangerous. But I don't think you get there from a rationality point of view.
Okay, so back to Cambridge.
Right, okay. We're still there.
I mean, well, I guess I just want to know about, your year at Harvard, and then how you ended up on the path you're on, how you ended up going into finance, basically, and then pursuing the creative things, which I'm kind of guessing from what you said about stability, that you figured out this is how I can use my intellect to earn a stable income and have the freedom to pursue creative things and things that are going to make my life fulfilling.
Sure. So I'll wrap that up in something which is probably quite complicated and misses off some things, but as the straightforward narrative. So you have those things running alongside of essentially death and what it is to try and do your stuff. And then Cambridge for Sciences are only 8-week terms, but you've actually got lectures in school on Saturday. So this is an interesting other thing which I don't think about. But I had Saturday morning school or lectures from the age of 12 to 21. So effectively, I'm kind of working 5.5 to 6 days a week for more or less most of my life, all the way up until 2021. And therefore, actually going to working life where you are kind of only working 5 days a week, it was actually weirdly slightly a step down in terms of just working on something. And then I was pursuing science to a high degree, tilting into cognitive science, experimental psychology, neuroscience at that time. But I had also, because I'd done some theatre at school, secondary school, high school, I thought, oh, let's do some more theatre. People say, like, you should go and do stuff, so I should go and do stuff. So I auditioned to be the director of the Freshers play, so the big sort of play that all newbies do. And I got the role with a co-director, and so that launched me into doing more theatre stuff. So then I directed a play kind of almost every year, or was involved, probably more than one play I was involved with for all my 3 years in Cambridge. So had a very much, and there was no, actually there was a little thing, but essentially there was no real drama course at Cambridge. So a lot of people were doing it from, so a lot of them are doing English, but not only doing that. And obviously they also have a comedy tradition through Footlights and stuff. So there's a big tradition of just putting on performing arts. And I was also writing a little bit as well. So I was doing all of those things. And then there was an opportunity to apply for a scholarship to Harvard, where you could do whatever you wanted to do, essentially, with this scholarship. So I then wanted to do more science, but I wanted to explore more arts. And obviously the US system has a much more of a liberal arts focus. So I got that scholarship, and I went to Harvard, where I then did some science, but I actually pursued artistic practice a lot more. And that was probably quite transformational in having some taught aspect of that. Still very creative. So I learned playwriting and dramaturgy under Adrienne Kennedy, who's a brilliant black playwright, one of the first black female playwrights really to do significant work in the US. And actually there was a relatively young dramaturg who's gone on to do great things kind of as an artistic director as well, called Gideon Lester, who actually had been to my high school, but I hadn't particularly known him there. And so I went and did his dramaturgy, and that was really interesting because he took us straight back. I don't know whether, I think he would say he wasn't necessarily sure what he was doing, but back to Aristotle's Poetics, and then fast forward to what the structure of drama was. And then that probably was a trigger for me. I was thinking about it from a director's point of view, and that's where I really started to thinking about it also from a writer's point of view, and that was with Adrienne Kennedy. And then I was really influenced by a poet called Forrest Gander, who, although we've not really kept in touch, I sent him a message. I managed to actually get one of these letters out. I sent him a letter a few years ago, and we had a tiny catch-up correspondence. But he was teaching at Harvard at the time, and he was a practicing poet, and he was just so into what it meant to have a creative, poetic life. And then we studied modern poetry, probably British American, but also international. He translated. And I mean, it's a really esoteric thing, right? Some of these poets probably, are only read by a few hundred to a few thousand people in the world, but still practicing their craft, what it meant to be. And poets are really interesting because the vast majority of poets are, actually my friend Rishi Dastadar says that, who's a poet, but he's also a copywriter. They're always poets / something else, because you can't mostly make a living just as a poet. And even poets who are often academics, like they have professorships or they teach, or they have something along the side. In fact, you have to be someone kind of as performative or as famous as Rupi Kaur, who's an Insta poet, or she's just a poet, but she's known for doing poetry on Instagram, to have that as your main career.
I live with a poet. So
okay, so
but she's also an artist.
So there you go. She's a poet / something. Yeah, maybe a lot of artists are slash as well. But there were probably more artists who are also just be artists. Anyway, so I did a lot of, with Forrest Gander, and then some poets around that. Although his was the main class, so a little bit with Jory Graham and some others, and then also quite influential. So all of these are influential to some degree. Was a photographer. So as I mentioned, actually, although I did a little bit of photography still at Cambridge, I probably had done more traveling when I was at school. I studied photography under someone called Chris Killip. Chris Killip actually just had a retrospective last year at the London Photographers Gallery, which you would think of as like triply ironic or something, because he'd always said, and this was one of the reasons that I then had gone on to a dual career, is that by and large, a lot of the great photographers are only really recognized once they're dead, which was unfortunate. And he also had a whole thing about what it meant to be a great photographer, but also what it meant to be a photographer who could make money as a career, and that they wouldn't necessarily correlate. He was quite famous for teaching at Harvard Photography for many years, and then actually Nan Goldin, who's extremely famous and can make a living as a photographer, also did some teaching at the time. She's also particularly famous for having taken on the Sacklers within the whole opioid thing. But so I spent so many hours taking photos in a dark room and thinking about visual images and what it also meant to photograph the world or not. And Chris Killip was really interesting on that, and also in terms of what it meant to have a career. And each of those taught me very, very different insights as to something. Sometimes there were just one or two, but really powerful thoughts. And sometimes there were amalgamations. So one of the really powerful thoughts, for instance, from Chris Killip, was this idea of, do you take photographs outside of a community, or do you take photographs within a community? And if you're outside of a community at extreme, are you just a voyeur? So you've taken a pretty or even beautiful photograph and you can see it visually, you can assess it, and like 9 out of 10 people say those are very beautiful photographs. But what have you caught? Are you a voyeur? Are you doing something different? And Chris Killip was quite interesting because a lot of his core work was done earlier in his life. He'd taken photographs of. He came from the Isle of Man, so from a Manx community. He'd done some work with sea coalers, which is communities which have pretty much disappeared now. They picked up coal from the sea and sold that, and done some work in the deindustrialization of Newcastle. And the sea coalers, who I think there might have been one other, but there's pretty much only 2 artists who've now documented that, and that's it. That's gone. They're no longer really a community in how they were hostile to outsiders. So he wanted to come and take photographs, and it didn't happen, and he went back, and there's a story of that. And then what happened is that there was someone there who he'd had an other time with, and said, "Oh yeah, no, Chris is a good bloke. You should let him on your runs." And then he was in the community, and then he took photographs from within that. And that was really powerful in my own artistic practice, in terms of thinking like, did I want to just do travel stuff like that, or was I going to think about something more in community, and how you write, where you're really writing because you're not taking advantage, say, of something. Actually, in terms of my photography practice, it was just around the corner from digital, and I didn't have a super good reaction for digital. So actually, into my early 20s, I stopped taking so many photographs. But anyway, that was the photography strand. And then actually I did basic sculpture as well, which was quite impactful for me. I learned how to use an arc welder, and like just thinking about objects in space, and all of these things which I guess you could get at a foundational art thing, but maybe not even that breadth. And my dad had just died, so I was probably throwing myself into everything, probably actually in a positive way. So maybe, maybe some people thought like, so most people take about 4 courses per term, I think roughly, or semester in Harvard. And I was probably taking 6, but also I was a special student, so it didn't matter. So this was great. It didn't matter what grade I got because I wasn't going to pursue, I wasn't going to have to be, I didn't have to worry about my GPA in poetry or photography or playwriting. I was learning because I wanted to write these things, which was even better. I think the offshoot of that is that you do get high grades because you're just doing it for whatever. So coming back to the grade things, the grades were completely unimportant, and it was sort of unimportant to the professors as well, because as a special student, I also did a directing one. This is all coming out. So I also did a directing one with quite a famous director at the time, and the auditions for that directing one were like kind of crazy. So there were like 100 people in the room trying to get onto this course, and you just got up and you spoke for a minute on why you wanted to do it, and then you were in or not. And I just spoke for a minute about why, and kind of my why was just so much more because I wanted to do directing. And then all of these people who'd had either more experience or more things from that were just not getting in on the course. So there was just something about, particularly on the creative sphere, it's because you wanted to create art in some sort of way, and how did it mean for you? And that whole year was exploring that with some structure and some great artists talking about how they do their work, and also examining other great artists, with then the huge privilege of having an enormous amount of resource and then time, and then I guess grief energy to just throw into doing stuff. And I directed a play as well, so was just doing a load of that. And then at the end of that, I traveled around Peru and then came back.
And you knew that was your final year, like you knew you were then going to go off and work after that.
Actually,
year.
So somewhere in the middle of that is where I was. That was where I was taking the year of deliberation, and then decided that. And so there was a couple of things. So one thing, both Forrest Gander and Chris Calypso, and the conclusion more or less was you could do great art and you could make a lot of money, and they weren't necessarily going to be highly correlated in your first few years, and they may never get correlated. So we saw a lot of people, particularly in poetry, where I thought was great poetry, and they were never really paid. And even some, I think, for instance, I think one of the greatest works of poetry ever was written by someone called Charles Resnikov, and underappreciated even to this day now, how the greatness of that work. And he worked more or less as a lawyer all of his life. So there was that strand. And then actually my neuroscientist professor as well, saying he spent quite a lot of time on funding applications, teaching, and less of his time on science. And it was obviously I had a lot of interest, and that actually you could probably deeply pursue a few things, particularly if you weren't worried about your art making money and you had a personal practice that you wanted to do, which I definitely wanted to do. And I was really interested in exploring play writing, and I was still a little bit interested in directing, but I guess playwriting and poetry ended up something that you could do while running alongside other stuff. You could probably do it still like as a novelist, and maybe to some degree as a visual artist and some other things. But novels, you have to write 50 to 100,000 words. Plays can take a lot of time to develop, but actually in pure word count is many fewer words. So that was all coalescing. And then I wanted to get back to my mum. I wanted to make sure that my mum was going to be well supported. Travel agents don't make a lot of money. She'd moved in-house as well, because our travel agency essentially had gone bankrupt, because once the internet come, margins on a travel business aren't very large. And so I ended up doing healthcare investments, so I wasn't completely giving up my neuroscience stuff, and then also being involved in the playmaking scene here in London.
And is that still the same approach you take to looking at your life and your creative pursuits, including your podcast? That it's like that's kind of for your purely curiosity and personal growth, and how you make money is through finance, and it's like separate.
Broadly speaking, I think there's probably a lot more intersections which are in the nuance. A lot of them are second order. So, as you'll have here, a couple of things which come from podcasts are the ability to hold conversation, the ability to listen, particularly active listening, I guess, and the ability to ask really good questions, or questions which can get you further into a conversation. Perhaps slightly easier with some kinds of podcasts. Those are actually 3 really important skills within business, and particularly when trying to figure out talking to management of companies and investing. So there's a lot more overlap than you might think. And then learning about how the world is really working, or how humans really think it's working, is much more vital than you might think. Because when you're trying to develop business, or in particularly investment, you don't want to fool yourself about how you wish the world to be, nor do you want to fool yourself about how a lot of other people, or whichever segment or stakeholder group is thinking about how the world is from their point of view. You really need to triangulate how the world really is from probably a multi-stakeholder view, and then you're trying to predict how the world will likely go, and then also you're trying to think about what everyone else thinks and where everyone else thinks the world is going to go. And if you are not, at least in my style of investing, really thinking quite hard about those factors, then you're not going to do very well. And podcasts and conversations, and actually artistic practice, is a deeper way, or not necessarily even deeper way, but it's a certainly lens way of really trying to understand how that world works. And my conversations also span some of these interests within healthcare or within sustainability and the like. And again, I would argue for my theatre practice, it's a way of understanding what it means to be human. And actually business and finance is a core part of what it means to be human. And at the end of the day, companies are run by individual people. They're run by CEOs, they're cross-checked by boards. That's maybe 24 people at the top of the chain, maybe even only 3 or 4 people at the top of the chain. And if you have 500 or 500 to 1,000 of the largest companies in the world, which are influencing a vast proportion, you could even argue a majority of the world with their interactions, you're really talking about perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 people at that top. And I'm in a really privileged position to have conversations with a huge percentage of those 2,000 or 3,000 people. And within the healthcare domain, maybe you could say there's 2,000 or 3,000 people within that, depending on that. And you want to have really good conversations with them. You want to make their businesses better, because, for instance, in healthcare, when you're doing business better, you're saving more people's lives. And you're also wanting to do that for the shareholder point of view, as well as patients and doctors and the like. And understanding humanity, call it in its broadest sense, I still believe makes that go better for this style of active investing. There are other styles, say quantitative trading and the like, and all of that, where this is less important, although I still think it has a place in terms of understanding the world in whatever you want to do. But particularly for that, I think there has turned out to be more overlaps than you think in deep fundamental investing in terms of where you think businesses and people are going to go.
It's also really important to solve problems, right? So if you're thinking about solving some of the big problems in the world, exactly as you described, if you want, like thinking about the climate, for example, if you want to see the world in a certain way, if you want people to be in a certain way, but you're not actually accepting the problem for what it, it's a bad place to start a problem solving if you haven't actually laid out clearly
the problem. Yes. Yeah, exactly. And then something really where you have to take the intersection of humanity. So take climate, and there's very many lenses to do this. But I would refer to someone else's work, which has been in parallel to some of my work. So someone actually I've done a podcast with, Nadia Asparova. She's done some work on looking at what she would describe as, I think she describes it as climate tribes. Maybe I'm describing it as climate tribes, but I'm going to call it climate tribes. And actually there's different ways of looking at that. But for instance, you could do two quite easy types of tribes or types of thinking at their either extreme. So one are degrowthers. So they are really advocating less consumption to get to the place of the world that they want to be. Another you would call techno-optimists. So they really think that innovation is the way forward. And perhaps there would be an easy third class of call them deniers. So they just don't think it's a problem. And there's significant amounts of people in either of those three camps. And to deny that means you're not going to get very far with the problem. So, for instance, in the US, there's around 30 to 35% of Americans who do not believe in man-made climate change. If that is your starting point and you want to cleave still to democratic representation of some point, you've got to bring those 30 to 35%, a third of your population, along with you. And if a third of your population do not believe in man-made climate change, that's actually quite problematic. And then you've got to think about, I don't know what the percentage is, this probably shifts and I don't have the American percentage. So if those would advocate for degrowth, so they want all of these restrictive, say, policies, and they just want much less consumption, but then you want to take into account these innovation people who just think you should throw a lot more money in technology, and technology is the answer. So the real starting problem, before you then even get into all of these other tribes, because it's very obvious that those three are conflicting and you can see it, that there's significant numbers and all of that, you need to kind of start with that reality if you want to solve that problem. Now, you might have a different stakeholder, a different theory of change, because you might be an activist and you want to change one or two of those blobs, and you very much adhere to your own ideas or own way of thinking within that. But then if you sit in the middle, depending on where your own strengths and weaknesses are, and you're trying to triangulate to move all of that forward to where you think you want the world to be, they're not taking into account the reality of that world. And then you get into all of these things about what are social constructs or what are not, what things are true because humans believe them to be true. Religion, money, laws, those type of things, which only have power because a lot of humans believe them to have power, as opposed to, say, gravity, physics, the world warming, all of those things, which have maybe a fundamental natural law to them and will happen regardless of whether humans believe in them or not. And therefore, when you're looking at the things which have power because humans believe in them or humans act within them, then how do those change? I guess this is all around social science, but you just go back 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the norm was almost every society or a huge bunch of societies had slaves, and they did not broadly value, even explicitly value, human life as the same. You go back to the laws of Hammurabi, first codified laws that we have. He explicitly sets different price of life on slaves, middle class people, aristocratic people, say one for the better word, and men and women. They have explicitly different prices codified in law that you wouldn't pay shekels of silver more or less for if you damaged, i.e. killed, these people. And that was adhered to because humans believed them. And then we changed our beliefs, obviously, I think, for massively the better. But you have to admit that that's how we thought. And you also have to go through the fact that we changed that thinking. And the complicated factors driving that, if you want to then make other sorts of change, is worth trying to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not like them, that's us, they're our ancestors.
Yeah, exactly. And so that goes back a couple of thousand years, right? You can only go back 100 or so years, and you think about, most women didn't have a vote in most countries, right? You think about women's rights, disability rights, all of these type of things. Some of them are really new human constructs within that. Slavery obviously goes back a little bit further, but all of these other things are pretty new phenomena within human scales.
Yeah, so these were some of the ideas, as well as the origins of capitalism, and that you were talking about in this other podcast. I was like, oh my God, I want to have this conversation. But to wrap this up, can I ask you the last 3 questions?
Sure, go for it.
How do you stay grounded?
How do you stay grounded? So, friends, family, my wife and children. So that's one way of staying really grounded with those connections. And then really just seeing other aspects of the world for what it is. So you can do that through lived experience, like travel, so going to see places and things. But you could also do it, say, even on the streets of London, right? Having a conversation with someone who's homeless, having conversations with people that you meet on the street, and those sorts of things. And then data can keep you grounded in all sorts of ways. So you can see how, on the one hand, we've got so much wealthier, whether you can look at it by GDP per capita or the minimum wage that people earn, or the fact that we have weekends now. 100 years ago, we didn't have a 2-day weekend, and all of those things. But then you can also look at the data and go, like, 1 billion people don't have access to toilets. 1 billion people don't have access to the internet. 850 million people or so at the moment are living on below $1.50 a day, below the poverty line. So lived experience mixed with data sets that we have, which are telling you what it is about the world, can keep you grounded in what you want to do.
Is there a book that's had an impact on your life? The first one that comes to mind.
The first one that comes, so I guess I'm triggered by books I have mentioned, but the couple of grief books I mentioned were the Herman Hesse Siddhartha and C.S. Lewis Grief Observed. The data book, which is just more recently, if you're interested in that bit, is by Hans Rosling, Factfulness. So those are a couple of things. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was obviously quite transformational as a piece of theatre. But interestingly, maybe it was triggered by having, I think a year or two before, I went to see Pygmalion at the National Theatre, had a really good time. And it's kind of one of those things which is quite popular, but also says, and it's a little bit old, but also says some other things. So as a kind of normal piece of theatre that you just go by randomly going to the National Theatre, that was a thing.
And finally, what 3 words describe the best version of you?
Kind, curious, creative.
Amazing. Thanks for chatting.
Great. Good to chat.
Cool.
Oh. Yeah, we can... There you go. And then you can...
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, feel free to share it with someone. And also, a random 23-year-old just messaged me on Instagram and told me he found the podcast through the algorithm. So it actually does help if you review the podcast and subscribe or follow. And then you get to find out about future episodes as well. Review or rate, you know what I mean. Anyway, it would truly make my day. So thank you in advance.